Well, good afternoon. My name is Ryan Streeter of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion today on the future of cities from an international perspective. I'm looking forward to our discussion and looking forward to the number of interesting topics that we'll cover. And before we get into that, I want to make sure that I introduce my co-panelists here and have my collaborator in this, Joel Cox, give some explanation for our time together today. We are in the final stages of editing a book called The Future of Cities that all of our panelists have contributed to, along with a number of people who aren't here with us today, to really look at some of these overarching questions that both make cities such interesting places, also shine some light on potential problems coming down the road for various cities across the world, things they have in common, and then things that make cities in different parts of the world different. And this will be the first of a number of events we'll do over the next few months and even year as we roll out these essays and once the book is published later this year. So let me just do some quick introductions here, and then we can dive right into our discussion. Again, I said I'm Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I am joined by Joel Cox as a co-editor and collaborator on the volume. Joel Cox is probably known to many of you. He's the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in California, and he's the executive director of the Urban Reform Institute, which is based in Houston. Next, we have Dr. Lee Sun, who is a lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of Leeds in England. She's an expert on urbanization, especially in the global South, and we'll look forward to hearing from you soon, Dr. Lee. Also, we are joined by Hugo Kruger, who's an independent writer and the host of the Hugo Kruger podcast. Covers a wide range of geopolitical issues. I'll get your name right the next time, Hugo. And fascinating podcast. I urge you to tune into that when you can. And also, he's joined by Becky Malobo, who's an analyst and an economic researcher at ETM Analytics, and is joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa today. I should say Dr. Lee is in the UK, and Hugo is in Paris. The others of us are scattered across the United States. So it truly is a global event about global issues. And finally, joined by Wendell Cox, who's the principal of Demographia, which is an international public policy firm. Wendell is also the founding senior fellow at the Urban Reform Institute as well, and a member of the advisory board of the Center for Demographics and Policy at Chapman University. So we're going to give everyone a chance to talk about some of their own research, which will be featured in the book, and some of the related issues. But before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel Cox to just give us some framing and some orienting remarks. And Joel, before I do that, let me just say to everyone who's tuning in that if you have questions, you can send those in to us. And then when we get to a point later on in our discussion where we have questions and answers, we'll get to your questions, but you're free to send them along anytime, and we'll keep a running tab of them. And you can send them in one of two ways. One, you can just email them to Michael Pugh at aei.org. That's michael.pugh@aei.org. Or on Twitter, you can send them to us at hashtag AEI City Series, all one word, hashtag AEI City Series. So if you have questions along the way, please do send them in. We will tabulate those and get to them later on in our discussion together. So before we turn to all the individual panelists, I'm going to hand this over to Joel Cox to set us up for today's discussion.
Thanks, Ryan. First of all, I want to thank AEI, Michael Pugh, and Ryan, of course, on getting this boat on the ocean. We are really what we really wanted to do is have a sort of new perspective on cities. One of the things that I have felt very strongly about is that our coverage of cities is very limited to a few places, focuses almost exclusively on major North American, sometimes Asian or European cities. There's the vast majority of people living in cities don't live in those places at all, as Wendell will show. We wanted to have a truly global perspective. I know from when I first started writing a book about the history of cities, and I read that most of the books were really about Europe. I mean, it's like Tokyo appears in 1950 as if it never existed before. So we want to really understand that this is a global phenomenon. And our perspective is a little bit different. I think a lot of the coverage of cities, frankly, is distorted by the fact that people who write about them live in a handful of cities, and they talk to people who also live in that handful of cities, and they never talk to anybody from the outside. Like, so that what you tend to see is a very myopic picture of the urban reality. Like right now I'm in New York City, which is my hometown. And the fact of the matter is that there are enormous amounts of the writing about cities in America and around the world are really about places like New York. And New York is a fantastic place. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening here, but it's not the norm. Actually, I would argue, and I'm sure Wendell would back me up on this, it's an anomaly. I mean, the reason it's going to be a great tourist destination is nobody will ever build another. There'll never be a city like New York. There'll never be a city like London. There'll never be a city like Paris. And they will remain iconic. But there's a difference between being iconic and being representative. They're just two different things. So we're going to try to bring that perspective. Like, for instance, in this book, we have a chapter about the Inland Empire, which is the only fast-growing area left in California, east of Los Angeles. Some people say, well, those aren't cities. Well, I would go with the notion of Frank Lloyd Wright that the city is wherever the citizen is. And if somebody's living in a suburb 40 miles from LA, it doesn't mean that they're not Californians or they're not Angelenos. They're just a different expression of the same urban phenomena in a different setting. So we really tried to bring those perspectives in that I think have generally been ignored. But the most important thing is to understand that cities themselves naturally grow, they naturally grow out. And one of the great problems I think urbanists have had is instead of accommodating the fact that people want to live in a little less crowded areas, maybe they want a single family home, they keep sort of saying, no, you shouldn't live that way. Well, the reality is that people want to live that way, and they're going to go that way no matter where they are. And if you try to stop them, they'll just move out of the whole metropolitan area. So our perspective is a little bit unusual from that point of view. And I think that what we really need to do is understand that people make the choice to live in a city for perfectly rational reasons, but they also make the decision to leave or to move for perfectly rational reasons. So the book is really about, if I would say, urbanism from the point of view of regular people, as close as we could get to it. How does the average person think? Now, just a little bit on New York, just because I happen to be here, still a great city, lots going on, but it's downtown. The whole CBD concept, which I'm sure Wendell can address, is past its prime. It's not going to go away, but it's very different. So the New York I see now on the streets is, first of all, a lot more retail vacancies, lots of young people, lots of energy, lots of immigrants, lots of people speaking languages other than English. So it's still a vital place, but the city of the future, particularly the core city, will be very much the way H.G. Wells saw it. He called it a place of concourse and rendezvous. And there are things that you can get in a city you just can't get in a dense city like a New York, like a London, like a Paris. There's no substitute for it. But as Wells also said, they would be places of elegant extinction because people will not have children in these places unless they're very wealthy. And the people who have families are going to move to the outskirts. He was a pretty smart guy for 120 years ago. And I think that his vision is now being carried out. And I think that's something we need to talk about. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you, Ryan. And but I hopefully will stimulate some thinking.
Yeah, great. No, that's great, Joel. And that's a great way of characterizing the book, Urbanism for the Rest of Us. Cities are big, vibrant, wonderful human creations, and the majority of people who live in them don't think of themselves as residents of the kind of iconic places that you talk about. And there's a reason for understanding them. And from the American perspective, as I've written about, and you have too, when you look at where people are going, people are going to other places, and they're going to other places for very valid reasons that a lot of urbanists and writers about cities just don't appreciate or respect, for sure. So I hope as we work through our discussion today, we'll be able to pick up on some of these themes. That's great. So we're going to start a discussion now here. Actually, some sort of short descriptions of the work that our panelists have been doing and what they've been writing about in their areas of expertise. And just as a reminder, if you do have questions, you can send those in by email to michael.pugh, PUGH@aei.org, or on Twitter, hashtag AEI City Series. And so now it gives me pleasure to turn the discussion over to Dr. Li Sun from Leeds University to talk to us about China. Even if you're not an expert, you probably just from casual reading would know that China's growth and urbanization are kind of one and the same thing in many ways. And there's a lot more about China's urban environment that a lot of us don't know, and especially probably just the size and scope of it is kind of hard for us to fathom. And because of that, presents all kinds of interesting challenges for the future. So Dr. Li, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. So as Rain just mentioned, China has experienced the fast urbanization in the world, and how fast it was. And I have some basic data for you. Like in 1980s, there were only 200 million people living in cities in China. But by 2020, that means after 4 decades, there are 900 million people. So the urban population has been increased significantly by 700 million over 4 decades. And how many cities are in total in China? And there are around 616 cities. And maybe you heard of like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. Those are mega cities with over 10 million population. But there are another 93 cities has population over 1 million. But like I mentioned, there are in total 616 cities, which we regarded other cities as small and medium cities. So this basic figure might give you the idea of the scale in China. And I want to start my talk from 4 aspects, which would touch upon about the current situation in Chinese cities. Like I already mentioned, the large number of cities in China, but actually, when you look at the GDP growth, you would find 75% of, actually 80% of China's GDP are generated in 19 city clusters. So when we look at urban development in China, we can't avoid to understand the important role of urban clusters. There are 19 in total, and 75% of Chinese residents living in those clusters. And I guess you might know Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, which is one of the largest city clusters in China. And you also know where Shanghai is, which is regarded as Yangtze River Delta, and also Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Bay Area. So those 3 key clusters are regarded as super mega city regions. And beyond the the importance of city cluster, actually since COVID, we also realize the rapid urbanization and digitalization in China. And by 2020, the total number of internet use in China was 989 million, and the majority, like 2/3 of those 989 million Chinese internet users are in cities. And it's really like concentrated e-commerce, because everyone doing online shopping, and also telecom and healthcare, and especially during COVID, many people would get the healthcare online or via telephone. For example, for the e-commerce sale, and China nearly account for half of the world e-commerce market, which was around $2.3 trillion in 2020. And there were more than 700 million online customers in that year. And actually, you understand the city cluster now, and you get some idea about the rapid digitalization and in China currently. But there are one of the main challenge we can not really think this would drive the sustainable urban development in the long term, which is a demographic challenge. You may know China has largest population with 1.4 billion, but actually the birth rate has been declining in the recent years. And the recent birth rate data was only 1.2, which is well below the replacement rate of 2.1 worldwide. And since 2021, China introduced the three-child policy, but many young people still indicate, despite the introduction of three-child policy, and especially in cities, they don't think they will have three child, or some of them even indicate they won't have a two-child either. For example, the fertility rate in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai was only 0.7, which really one of the lowest in the whole world. So you may ask, okay, and China abolished the one-child policy. Now there are three-child policy, but why young people still don't want to have a baby? I think many of them would concern about the cost of living and the cost of childcare and quality of education, housing issue, and also the elderly care, because Chinese society is aging rapidly. Even by the end of 2020, there are around 200 million Chinese people above 65 years old, so which account for roughly 14% of the total population. And meanwhile, the life expectancy has been increased from 67 years old back to 4 decades ago to 7 years old nowadays. So you can imagine, with a low birth rate and also increased number of aging population and the longer life expectancy, which really reshape Chinese society, especially in cities. I would think this is one of the key challenges China would face in the coming decades. And undoubtedly, because of those population change, a Chinese city would face the shrinkage of the labor force. Before, when we think about cities in China, and one of the very distinguished group would be the rural to urban migrant workers, because like now we are using laptop, and most of our clothes also are made in China. So those migrant workers drive China as a world factory, but actually the number is also decreasing in the recent years because of the population and change. So therefore, just to kind of short summarize, it's undoubtedly China's urbanization has been successful, like those basic data I gave to you. But now China facing some challenges, such as the population and also the social inequality between different social groups. Therefore, I think there is still a long way to go and much to do in order to achieve an inclusive and sustainable urbanization in China. Thank you very much.
Sorry, there, sound issue. Yeah, Joel, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I just wanted to link together what Lee Sun was saying about the urbanization and the low birth rate. We found that urbanization has had the effect of lowering birth rates generally. Is that part of the reason for the big demographic decline? And obviously that's going to be a long-term issue, but is urbanization and the demographic decline in China, are they related?
Thank you, Joe. Actually, I think there is no only one factor can contribute to the low birth rate, right? And urbanization definitely might be one of the reasons. Especially many people living in Chinese cities, they need to like suffer from the high rise housing price, and many young couples, they even can't afford a flat to live, and they even don't think they could have a place to even start a family.
And one question I had, Lisa, and too, following up on that, is the population and demographic shifts have certain known consequences. We don't know when, and obviously there's things in the future we can't see, but obviously future productivity, the ability of the state to provide services, and these sorts of things are one of the effects of this downward sort of demographic slope. But you also talked about the rising inequality in cities in China as well, which seems to be a combination of the way migration has happened between high and low skilled workers and the way that they're actually incorporated in each kind of metropolitan community. What do you, when you think into the future of that issue, what should people be most concerned about there? That the effects of that are a little bit harder to game out.
Yeah, actually, it's a very interesting question. I would think the government needs to do more to provide decent social protection to no-skill, rural to urban migrant workers, because there are also significant number of highly skilled migrant workers who get very high education background and who are employed like in very top corporates. And most cities would welcome this group of high income or high skilled migrant workers, and they could enjoy very good social benefits. But the no skilled one who might be the cleaner and who might be the taxi driver, and they don't have that decent social benefits. So I think that would be really one of the concern of social inequality.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. And we can come back to other issues related to China's urbanism when we get into urbanization, we get into questions and answers for those who might have questions about that. But let me turn this over now to Hugo and Becky to take us part way around the world to Africa. And I know they've co-authored a chapter for the book that we're publishing, but also have their own independent work on a whole range of issues related to what's going on there. Another fascinating place where urbanization is almost hard to get your mind around. So Hugo, I think I'll kick it over to you, and then Becky, you can follow on when he's done with his remarks.
No, thank you, Ryan. So I've got just a few messages on Africa. The first challenge always when you're dealing with Africa is data is hard to get, even among Africans themselves. So a lot of the assumptions that are made, as soon as you make them, the data is almost outdated and you don't have new data. But as far as we can gather on the UN projections, by the end of this century, 4 out of 10 people in the world will be African. Okay, that's assuming the projections of population growth are correct. You can pick a number, maybe it's 3 out of 10. But either way, Africa's numbers are exploding the population. Our population is young. I mean, the average age in Africa is 24 years old compared to Europe, compared to North America. So you've got a young, dynamic youth, but we face enormous obstacles. So to understand where African cities come from, you need to look at history. That's generally how we do the analysis, and take into account that Africa was colonized for a very long time, so almost 70 years, some places, South Africa much longer than that, and different African countries were colonized by different European powers. So the nature of the cities, the locations they are in, is informed by the type of colonialism that took place. Okay, and obviously how the post-colonial era evolved, because we've now had in some areas 50, 60 years of post-colonialism. So give you an example. In Europe and North America, most cities are located along the coast because it will settle for trade and for commerce. It's easy to get a ship on the harbor. Africa's got almost no significant navigable river. You've got some parts of the Zaire River, some parts of the Nile you could put stuff on, but generally you can't. So you find the African cities are located in the interior, but they don't have access to transport. So they rely on railways. And that's why Africa was colonized only after the railway came in, for example. So you find Johannesburg, we're almost in Johannesburg, Pretoria, what is called the Gauteng area, where a great part, I think a quarter of South Africa's population lives. In that area, there is no navigable river. There is no lake. So the water has to come all the way from Lesotho, for example. That's why in 1998, when there was a coup d'etat in Lesotho, Nelson Mandela, of all people, sent in the army and said, no ways, guys. If you take over the water, that's our national security interest. So you find that African leaders have an enormous obstacle, which is geography. Africa is a very high continent. Johannesburg is higher than the Swiss Alps. Okay, they're higher than Zurich, for example. You wouldn't think of it if you're there, but this is to gravitate water all the way, to get water all the way there is a big challenge. To get food all the way there is a big challenge. So our transportation cost is much higher in comparison with the rest of the world, for example. And that makes our politics becomes much more susceptible to inflation. It becomes much more susceptible to any kind of shock in the international system. So how does that inform then, you will say, the city itself? What about Johannesburg, Pretoria? Well, we are facing these challenges at the moment where South Africa, and Becky will get into this more detail later, South Africa has got electricity shortage. South Africa has got a water shortage. This is the most industrialized country on the African continent. Imagine what it looks like in Chad, where 80% of the population works in subsistence agriculture, for example. So you find all these challenges first have to overcome. But now we face this problem where we are urbanizing. People are leaving the countryside thanks to industrial agriculture that's finally arrived in Africa, as was the case in the United States. They're migrating to the cities, and you find the cities are not well prepared to absorb the enormous population. Johannesburg's population almost doubled after Nelson Mandela became peerless in the 1990s until the year 2000 or so. So within a very short period of time, the population doubled. No, it's very difficult for the infrastructure to keep up. On top of that, we've had series of civil wars and strife and inter-conflict in the rest of Africa. What happens to those people? Well, they also come to Johannesburg because that's where jobs and opportunities are. So you have to absorb the massive amount of migrant people. So the message I sort of leave here, the other thing as well is the way the colonial system managed was it managed with a pattern of what was called separate development. It was Cecil John Rhodes's idea of grand apartheid. And it wasn't just in South Africa, it was throughout the African continent, where in the cities you had generally the European-speaking population or tribal chiefs, which was a form of indirect rule, had certain quarters for themselves around the cities. You had what was called townships, which is places generally where the migrant workers would come and stay. And over time, they will evolve into their own type of communities. So you have Soweto around Johannesburg, stands for Southwest Township, for example. This was initially for the mine workers, but over time, as these people migrated, you find that they became, I think, almost bigger than Johannesburg these days. So all of those things are informed, I think, by history itself. And any challenge we have to we face, you first have to overcome, I guess, the history that comes with it. Then just the last system is the question of safety in numbers, which the Europeans and the people who managed the country historically did not have what was called safety in numbers. So unlike Europe and North America and Australia, that was settled through large settler colonial populations, African populations, the rulers generally didn't do so. So they had to make deals with the tribal and the local communities. And this is why the British imperialism in particular had a very unique form, which was not unlike the German one in Namibia that caused mass slaughter of the population. Instead, it was a slow creep up and a slow development, and also a training of many of the African leaders through missionary schools initially as sort of future leaders of the country. And initially, these were the people that rebelled and overthrew the governments. So when you look again into the city patterns, just a message I'll leave you, and I'll give it a bit here, is make sure that the history informs, history itself is probably the best guidance to understand the way that the cities develop and what challenges they will overcome. And I would say that the primary lesson for me from Africa is geography, geography, and geography. The cities have to overcome the complex geography.
That's great.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, thanks very much for those insights, Hugo. Lots to think about there. I'll turn it over to you, Becky, to follow on.
Yeah, thank you there, Ryan, and thank you there, Hugo. So Hugo touched on something very important, and that is the historical aspect, as well as the geographical challenges that Africa, some African countries, as well as African cities face. But one of the sections that we also touched on, and I think this is particularly not looked into that much and with great detail is really the policy aspect that would come with the future development of cities in Africa. Now, when you're talking about a city, what is a city? A city is essentially human settlement where people from different cultures, different religions come to settle and seek higher living standards, as well as to better themselves as well as that of their families. Now, in order to see a prosperous city, you would need to see high levels of economic performance. Now, this is where policy comes into to be the main objective. Now, if you have bad policy, unfortunately, that results in low levels of economic conditions, as well as that of challenges that future cities may face in Africa. Prime example of this is if you look at South Africa. Now, before I start to talk about the challenges that comes with South African cities, I'd like to start off with the successes that has been seen primarily in South Africa, as well as other African countries. And that is in regards to that when you see what happened with policy in the country. Now, when I ask a particular individual from the Western world is that, what is property rights? This may seem as a silly question, but property rights are the fundamental institutions for there to be high levels of economic success. Unfortunately, in Africa, property rights are fundamentally being undermined by governments around the world, which has now resulted in low levels of living conditions. Now, when you look at South Africa from the period 1994 until the period of 2007, this is the early years of South Africa's democracy, the early years of the ANC rule. And in this period, you saw the leadership of Nelson Mandela, as well as that of Thabo Mbeki. These individuals, these political leaders, actually held right policies such as strengthening that property rights, following the policies such as GEAR, which was essentially about including free markets in South Africa, integrating South Africa with international trade, and that resulted in high levels of economic performance. In fact, from the period 2004 until 2007, South Africa grew at the same level as other emerging markets with an average GDP about 5%. That resulted in the doubling of the number of people employed across all racial groups, as well as across cultures, as well as an increase in the urbanization rates in the country. In fact, another important statistics that's quite relevant for the development of cities is when you look at indicators such as that of access to electricity, access to that of water, those indicators increased by an average of about 180% in that time period. Now, that was because of the policies that were followed. Subsequent to that period, under the leadership of Jacob Zuma and now Cyril Ramaphosa in 2007, where the ruling government of the country implemented policies that fundamentally undermine property rights, that fundamentally undermine the rule of law in the country, as well as the judicial effectiveness of South African courts. What you've seen is the 10 years worth of economic stagnation in the country, where the country has struggled to surpass 2% of GDP. And that has resulted in large levels of crime levels in the country, to the point where each and every single day, according to police statistics here in South Africa, there's about 10 violent protests each and every day. That has increased by about 400% since 2007. Very detrimental to what happens in cities. In fact, a ripe example of this is what happened in the country last year, July, which was deemed the July unriots, where you had a large population of young South Africans that currently do not have a job, currently faces little economic prosperity. They are economically excluded because of the stagnant economy that faces them. You saw large levels of protest action across two provinces mainly, that being Gauteng, as well as that of KZN. Now, this is also true when you look at other African countries around the world, where you start to see stagnating living standards, you start to see rising terrorism acts. And this is exactly true, something that me and Hugo touched in the paper here, where in certain countries, there's a risk of rising terrorism in these particular countries, which we've estimated to be about 52% of African GDP, about 70% of Africa's land surface, that is quite vulnerable to terrorism attack, as well as the increase in terrorism in the continent. And this is because when you have an economy that's stagnant, when you have individuals now sitting at about 12.2 million South Africans that are currently unemployed, primarily of which are the youthful population, these individuals carry their frustration to the streets. They carry their frustration by burning businesses. They carry through their frustration when you see high levels of crime levels in that country. And in order for there to be a successful developing city, these are the core issues that need to be solved. And some of those core issues, those structural risks that's currently facing a country, is now 100 days of power outages in South Africa. This is the worst power outages that the country has ever faced because of the way of thinking that the ruling government handles policy. When you start to have bad way of thinking, that results in bad policy, and unfortunately that results in low levels of economic conditions, as well as that of low levels of living conditions, which are fundamentally detrimental to the development of future cities.
I just want to add something there, very important when he speaks about bad thinking. The one mistake that I think Western analysts make, which the Chinese analysts ironically don't make when they look at Africa, is that Western analysts do not take into account the effect of revolutionary ideology and radical ideology as much as the Chinese. When the Chinese come to Africa, they've read all the history books. They know exactly what they're dealing with. Okay. When the World Bank and the IMF comes, they talk about markets and free trade, and as if it's taken for granted. And that to me is the fundamental difference. And that I think is why, and we touched on this in the paper as well, why I think China at one stage is eating America's lunch in Africa. Because the Chinese come in, they understand that, look, you cannot just have a policy framework. Yes, that's important, but they need infrastructure development because they didn't train people for years because the revolution said liberation before education, okay, whether you agree with that or not. That is the mindset needs to change. And then you ask yourself, why is it that the government in Africa is seeing all these things collapse? I mean, the governments are not stupid. They're not irrational. It's because the revolutionary ideology is being put in front of economic common sense. And that is something I think that anyone who deals with Africa has to take into account. And I think it's true in Latin America as well, by the way.
Well, it sounds like California.
Yes.
Are there signs in any cities that younger, more urbanized individuals are less prone to revolutionary ideology, or is the urbanization not also being accompanied by kind of a lack of certain kind of traditional divisions between people groups, and also a tendency to gravitate towards these things? Because on your telling, it sounds like the stagnation slide after this time of economic growth is what's primarily opened people up to kind of more radical ideologies.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a function of employment, essentially. If you have a job, you don't have time for the nonsense in your head. So if you have radicalized youth, I mean, but this is the problem that we face. We have a lot of young men, essentially, that are unemployed. I mean, there's some analysts who suggest that even if we get the right policies today, many of the unemployed people will never have a job. Okay, so it's very difficult to tell them not to buy into any of these ideologies. Good example now is Mozambique. There's the Islamic State is in Cabo Delgado, in the north of Mozambique. It's a place that has been neglected by the Mozambican government for a very long time. And what is happening there? Well, the Mozambicans are asking themselves, why is it that the Islamic State is there? Well, the answer is very simple. There's been no development for years. Do you expect anything else, right? And you see it in the cities is the most radicalization. And I reflect a bit because my wife's from Middle East. The reason why the Shah of Iran fell was because of mass urbanization, and then in the madrasas and in the radical mosques around the cities, that's where they bought into the revolutionary ideology in Iran. And that's why it was overthrown. Okay, Africans, the ideology might be different, but the phenomenon is very similar.
Yeah.
But if I may, sorry, go ahead there.
No, go ahead, baby.
Yeah, so there's a very important point that I wanted to touch on that also Hugo touched on there, and this is also the question that you asked there, is, and I agree with Hugo, is when you start to see low levels of economic growth and stagnation, and high levels of of poverty. I mean, South Africa, and I constantly refer to South Africa because it's something that Hugo touched on, is that other African countries, data is quite scarce. But when you're looking at the unemployment, the unemployed youth in the country, that currently sits at about 75% under the expanded definition. In fact, here's another dangerous statistic. If you were to take all unemployed South Africans, which currently sit at about 12.2 million under the expanded definition. What the expanded definition is, it includes people that have simply given up on seeking employment because employment opportunities in the country are so dire. There's a lack of jobs going around now. If you were to take those individuals and you ask them to stand in your queue, standing 3 meters apart, you would see a line that starts from Cape Town running all the way to Cairo in Egypt. That's how dire living conditions have become in the country. And once you have that, and also seen in other African countries, you therefore have this environment where you're facilitating and you're fueling an environment of high levels of violence and high levels, unfortunately, of crime levels, as well as radicalization.
Yeah, and then the last one I want to add on that is just the role of sanctions. I know it's a controversial point in the United States, but Zimbabwe has been sanctioned since Robert Mugabe came to power in 1980. Mugabe is dead. The sanctions are still there. Okay. Not that his replacement is much better, but the sanctions resulted in economic collapse in Zimbabwe. Okay. Also, Mugabe's nationalization policies definitely contributed to that. But be that as it may, at one stage, a quarter of Zimbabweans were living in South Africa. So the other issue that lies through all of these things is that if it goes bad in an economic powerhouse like South Africa, it goes bad for the whole continent. But there's local failures in some smaller, you can call it economically less significant African countries, and that also affects us eventually. And that in turn radicalizes our politics because we have politicians that are active, that openly xenophobic, for example. I mean, so you see, these things have to play it out. I mean, for a country to do well, it has to be well with its neighbors as well, in a certain sense.
Very good, thank you. One relevant question from the outside that I'll pose to you now is whether there are cities in Africa that are a model, that is, those that are overcoming geographical problems and governance and economic problems. Is there a favorite city that seems to be kind of the counterexample to the trends you're talking about?
I won't say favorite. There's a few cities that are doing decently well. I mean, I would say Botswana is always an example of what to do in Africa. Okay, it's the country that gets everything right. When it became independent, it was the poorest country. Today, it's the richest per capita. Okay, because it focused on good governments, it actually skills its population, it used the diamond wealth to train the people, not loot it for the political elite, things of that sort. So Gaborone, in the capital of Botswana, and do yourself a favor, if you ever visit South Africa, go to Mafeking, just on the border, and then you go to Gaborone. You see the contrast. Both sides of the country is Tswana population, same people, different policies. Botswana is doing a lot better. Kigali, I would say, in Rwanda. Although I must say there's massive human rights abuse accusations against Paul Kagame. He might be a Lee Kuan Yew, but he's a Lee Kuan Yew that tortures you. You know, so that's also a little bit of a problem. He doesn't allow political dissent, but he seems to be enforcing the correct policy. So he's inspired by the Singaporean model. And then Namibia is also, it depends how you see Namibia, but I would say, remember, Namibia and South Africa both had apartheid. These two countries you can always compare to each other. And I would say Windhoek in Namibia, there's some very good policies. One thing Namibia got right is since the outset, they banned any form of racial classification. It started banned in Namibia. So in other words, they more tend to employ people based on merit. It's not as big an issue as in South Africa, where there's political tribalism and race-based legislation and things of that sort that can influence the political system. But Namibia has also got similar challenges with corruption. So, you know, I'm holding it up as a country, but it's not, I would say, ideal. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks for that. All right, it's a fascinating topic, and we could stay on it for a while, but I'm going to turn this over to Wendell now to round out our initial discussions, our presentations here. And I know Wendell has some slides. Wendell, did you want to comment before? Well, we're going to the slides. Let's do that.
No, that's okay. Could you? Yeah, let's get going. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm going to give a little bit of a background about what's been happening with cities, a bit of a history, some thoughts about current trends, and of course, some thoughts about the future, which is, of course, always threatening to do. First thing, though, to understand, there's a lot of misunderstanding about cities, and the press and even academia often misses the point, misses major points. First of all, most census authorities around the world consider that there are two types of land in the world. One is urban, and one is rural. Now, that may sound strange, but there are urban planners, for example, that don't consider suburbs to be part of the city. Well, they are a part of the city. We hear about how the world is now more than 50% urban, which it is. But the press, when they talk about it, lead you to believe that we're talking about Fifth Avenue or the Champs-Élysées. But no, we're not. In fact, the average urbanite in the world, the average urban resident in the world lives in an urban area of about 600,000 people. Now, that's a big urban area, but it's not a New York or a London or a Paris or a Shanghai. It's about the size of Springfield, Massachusetts, or Sheffield in the United Kingdom. So what we've got in this chart here, a little graphic to try to suggest, what cities really are. I mean, we all know about cities proper, and I always like to use the case of Paris. Everybody knows about Paris, one of the greatest cities in the world, yet that city proper is only 1/6 of the metropolitan area and 1/5 of the urban area. The urban area being the continuous urbanization, the metropolitan area being beyond the continuous urbanization, where people can commute into the urbanization. And what we've seen happen, and go to the next slide if you can, a lot of people don't realize, next slide. A lot of people don't realize it, but a lot of the core cities or the cities proper have lost population. You think about Paris, for example, went from 2.9 million people in 1921 to about 2.2 now. Think about Chicago, that went down 1 million from 3.5 million in 1950. Even Shanghai, in recent censuses, the core of the city has been declining at the same time that the overall city is increasing hugely. What we have is a situation where suburbanization, moving to the periphery, and it's not so much moving by central city people to the periphery as it is people being attracted to the city from outside the city. In the United States, if you look at the urban form, about 85% of our metropolitan areas are suburban as opposed to core city. And by the way, this picture in the background, to give you an idea, I'm talking about the universality of suburbanization. Now, this is not what all suburbs in China look like. They look like the towers, for the most part, that we see on news reports and so on. But this happens to be, this shows you they also have detached housing that looks somewhat like America. Around the world, there are all forms, a great number of forms of suburbanization. They look different. When you go to Australia or Canada, which are almost as suburban as America, they look almost the same. You go to India, obviously they look different. You go to South Africa, they look different. And even, believe it or not, Hong Kong, which is the densest urban area in the first world, high income world. Hong Kong has a higher GDP per capita than its former colonial masters, the United Kingdom. Even in Hong Kong, the growth has been in the suburbs. If you look at what has happened with respect to urban population, say since 1950, virtually all of the major cities have had most of their population growth in the suburbs. Now, one has to be careful to make sure you look at suburbs that have not combined with with cities that have not increased their land area or combined with another city. But you can look at places like Manila, 96% of the growth has been suburban. Shanghai, 87, Tokyo, 86, Calcutta, 85, New York, 95. This has been the pattern all over the world, even a place, as I say, like Hong Kong and even like Singapore, where the city itself, like everywhere else, grew out from the core and eventually got up to the channel that gets you across the way to Malaysia. Next slide, please. We've seen, incidentally, a lot of people think all the jobs are downtown or in the central business district. Not so. Even in New York, only 20% of the jobs in the metropolitan area are in the central business district. In London, the same kind of thing. In Shanghai, you have parts of Shanghai, like the area out by Hangzhou Airport, which are what we call edge cities, suburban business districts. This is a picture of Manila. Manila reminds me of Houston or Dallas-Fort Worth. Manila has 9 that I can count, central business districts located in the suburbs. The old central city is not one of the biggest districts, central business districts in the city. So what's going on, or in the metropolitan area? What's going on around the world is just like residents before. That is, just like the houses, the jobs are now suburbanizing all over the place. And in fact, in the United States, while we have many of these edge cities or suburban business districts that look like this, or not quite this impressive, in the United States, more than 70% of the jobs are now located outside CBDs and outside these suburban office centers. So then, if we could, the last slide, and we'll conclude with this. This is a photo of a billboard I took in Dubai, which is basically talking about the joys of owning your own home. So I had to stop and take a picture of it. The point is that the middle class in our cities around the world is under threat. It's under a hell of a lot more threat, obviously, from what we've heard in places like South Africa than it is in the United States or Western Europe, but it still is under threat. The principal cause in some of the more advanced countries is a cost of living crisis. And it is driven by the cost of housing, just like what you see in China at this point. Housing affordability largely defines the cost of living. Now, the OECD, one of the problems is that a lot of planning agencies around the world have set as their principal goal the stopping of urban sprawl. And that's fine, except when you draw lines around cities, you've raised the prices of land on the inside. And so what you have is incredible cost increases in cities that have, in urban areas that have done this kind of three. So much so that the OECD is out now with a report that basically is called Revisiting Urban Sprawl. And what they've suggested is one has to be real careful to leave enough land to develop so you don't raise the price of land so high that you cannot preserve housing affordability. And that's going on. And the great concern I have is there seems to be no recognition of the fact that this is going on. And unless we get housing affordability under control, we're not going to be able to deal with the threat to the middle class, which is the cost of living crisis. Now, at the same time, there's hope. I mean, things are going pretty well. They're not going as well as they should, but they're going to go better in the long run. The other big thing that's changing is the adoption of remote work that occurred during the pandemic. We have central business districts around Canada, the United States, Australia, some in Europe, where central business districts are almost abandoned at this point, as so many people are now remotely working because they don't want to commute anymore. So there is the possibility in the long run that this movement toward remote work will tend to disperse the population away from hideously, highly unaffordable places like San Francisco, Sydney, Vancouver, and Auckland, as people move further out to places that are less expensive, and that may be one of the answers in the long run. But there's no question the city has been great for society. If you go back, and Elaine Berteau at NYU has pointed this out, if you go back and you look at what the world was like back before 1800, when the largest city in the world was Beijing, and when there were no other cities with more than 1 million people, and the world urbanization rate was less than 5%, and you look at the GDP per capita that has happened since that time, you see huge increases and a huge connection to cities. And we can only hope in the long run that cities will be able to restore their prosperity. And not only will the middle class thrive, but also so we will be on a road toward eradicating poverty. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that, Wendell. That's fantastic. And one immediate question that comes to mind is just, I wanted to get your take on what you think the future of downtowns is right now. And you referenced this when you're talking about the rise of remote work. I mean, it seems like over time, kind of globally, as your slides showed, that in some ways expensive downtown areas have been able to get themselves off the hook of having to deal with housing affordability issues precisely because of suburbanization, right? I mean, as people move out to places where it's cheaper to build and they're willing to endure whatever commute they have to do, that model sort of works for the city leaders who don't have to worry about the policies in the suburbs. They just have to worry about their own. They can get away with it for a while, but nobody saw this global pandemic coming along with where we are technologically that allows people to work remotely. And it does seem like it has some pretty serious implications for downtown. If those buildings aren't going to be occupied by businesses anymore, employing people, if some of them want to convert, and I think we've all looked at some of the stories where some office buildings are now converting themselves into residential centers. But you do have to wonder whether or not these changes are going to have some serious implications for downtowns that we hadn't thought were possible before.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Just yesterday, the San Francisco Chronicle ran an article. And by the way, San Francisco is one of the real disaster zones in the world in terms of what's happened to downtown. Very low occupancy compared to what it used to be before. And they're basically saying what we need to do is what Calgary is doing. And the city of Calgary, largest city in Alberta, has undertaken a program to move toward conversion of as many buildings as they can in the downtown area, which is a very impressive downtown area for a new city and a city of only 1.5 million people. So moving toward, I mean, I think in the long run, there's a chance we're going to see some very attractive urban environments arise in these downtown areas where now you can create a walkable city. You can't have a walkable city in one that spreads over 3,000 square kilometers. Oh, and we have many of our cities around the world that spread over 3,000 square kilometers. You can't have walkability at that case, but you could have some wonderful neighborhoods, things that already exist in their own way in Manhattan, where in New York, and it'll happen elsewhere. In downtown LA for the most part, which is not a huge downtown area given the size of the community. I went into a program of giving tax breaks to rebuild. To redo office buildings into residential buildings, and it's been very successful. So it's good. The city is going to be different, and I don't think anybody expects downtowns to return to the way they were, because we have a lot of young kids that are a lot younger than me that don't see why they're supposed to commute between half an hour and an hour each way a day to work.
Can I ask a question, Ryan?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, to Lee Sun, because I mean, we've had in the Western world, and maybe even in South Africa, people can vote with their feet. They don't have a government that's controlling everything. I've been in Chinese cities. They all try to be ersatz Manhattans. What's happening with remote work? Is that something that's continuing to happen in China? Does the government have a policy about it? Because maybe it would even threaten their control.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's very interesting question. Since in early 2020s, China contained COVID within 3 months, right? So when rest of the world start to knock down and enforce working from home or online learning, actually China already open up. I mean, the domestic society has been open up because the lockdown only lasted for 76 days in between January and March. And it's a very short period. So many people haven't really get adjusted to working from home, and then they went back to office. And it's even until now, we don't think working from home would become very permanent in China in the coming years.
That's interesting.
Can I comment on something there? Just say, this is I think there's a risk we have as well. While I do appreciate the benefits of remote work, I have to declare I'm a structural engineer or civil engineer by trade, and we still build stuff, that work for the energy sector mainly. And I find it very difficult to see how you're going to industrialize Africa without heavy industry, the way the road that China and Asia and those places went. And I'm a bit skeptical that even our politicians are now beginning to talk about working from home, where most of the population still works on markets as traders, face to face. So there seems to be a little bit of a detachment coming between policymakers and just reality. And I sort of leave it as an open question here, what the panelists think is going to happen because of that.
Well, not everybody is going to be able to work from home. I mean, we know that, I can't remember what the exact percentages of the United States, but there are a lot of people, there are plumbers who work from home, but don't work remotely. They drive around and they work where they have to work. So, and office work is very conducive to working at home. Retail work is not. So there are major parts of the workforce that it's not feasible really ever to work from home. And my sense would be in Africa, what is likely to happen to working at home is going to be, it will go as far as it can go. It may be very limited but there's going to come a day where it may be bigger because you'll have more office jobs, but we're probably a long way from that at this point.
Yeah, it's going to vary very much by sector, and a lot of us are having to hypothesize based on imperfect previous analysis of these issues, right? Like we'll know a lot more in 5 years how productive or unproductive certain types of companies in certain sectors have become when they've been in an environment where almost everyone that's working there has been hired remotely and they haven't actually worked together. And does that matter? In certain creative industries or in places where there has to be production by teams, you wonder whether or not that lack of three-dimensional human interaction will affect them. And it is hard to believe that in some sectors where people really do enjoy being together, where they've moved to a place because they want to be around people like them and work together, that's a pretty strong part of the human condition that seems hard to turn off.
But I would just add right there for a second, because I lived in Hollywood for many years and worked in Hollywood. Actually, all my neighbors, because my neighborhood was overwhelmingly entertainment people, almost everybody worked at home. But there was an important, and this is a role for cities, they needed places to gather. They needed, instead of, as they would say in Hollywood, they would take meetings. That's one of their phrases. But the meeting could be at the deli. The meeting could be at the restaurant. The meeting could be, or in some companies to retreat. So we may see ways, because I think Ryan's very right, that some of these people do need to be together. Now, whether if they come in twice a week, 3 times a week, that will be enough. But I think that there's also cities could play a very important role in, like, even for me right now, I'm in New York. I have lots of editors in New York. I can walk to all my appointments. I can get a lot done that I could not do if I was doing it at home. So I do think that there's a part of the thing is that cities are going to have to figure out how to play the role that H.G. Wells assigned them. And that means also basic things like, Becky was talking about crime. I mean, one reason you don't go to Chicago, downtown to the Loop in Chicago anymore is because it's dangerous. I grew up in New York in the 70s. It was dangerous. My aunt got, mugged and beaten up in Brooklyn. You would walk down the street and you look behind, wondering if anyone was gaining on you. And so if cities are going to reinvent themselves, they're going to have to deal with that. I think, Becky's point about private property is very important, but I think personal security might even be a bigger point.
Well, and by the way, one other thing, I think the emerging model is sort of the hybrid model. We're not talking, not everybody is going to be working from home all the time. And Professor Bloom at Stanford and his colleagues have done a bunch of work, continuing surveys on the issue. And what they're basically suggesting is we're probably going to, where it can happen, it's going to be more like 3 days a week. There'll be people that work 4 and there'll be people that work 1. But sort of that hybrid model is a way to get at the team thing.
I have another question sort of for people to speculate on is, we are seeing again in the energy sector and in the water sector more localized solutions. So, in the past where a state like California would have had massive water infrastructure for the entire state, I think those times are a little bit coming to an end. Now you have private investors saying, well, the state's water is failing, or in South Africa, the water is failing. We're going to do it ourselves, right? So you have like either community level or a business level. And we are seeing that coming to energy solutions as well. They've got mini grids all over Africa. It's a semi-feudal system in a certain sense, but it's better than having no electricity, right? And, people can now put an LNG tank or a solar panel next to it and sort of have a little of a local economy. And just curious, that might, in certain senses, restart smaller towns. I'm not sure if, sort of open up that discussion as well.
Yeah, so if I may add there, Hugo, I think I 100% agree with you. This is, I think there's a reason you brought this up, because you see it primarily as well here in South Africa, particularly where you start to see these local towns forming. Particularly, it started off in mostly suburban areas, but I also see this in some of the points that you touched on there, Hugo, in township areas where now, for example, roles that were primarily state driven, as well as the state taking a primary role in taking over those basic facilities, such as that of preventing crime, such as that of providing water, have now been taken on by local communities. For example, if you see now it's what's happening with gated communities, you have communities now before you could simply just roll with your car there, perhaps see your neighbor, your friend, but now you see high walls, electric fences, private security. If there's any issue, there's someone there within the next 5 minutes, compared to a police officer that you'd be lucky if he shows up in the next day or two. So you start to see these buildup of local communities, in which Hugo touched on there on water. You start to see, for example, in certain areas and rural places as well, where municipalities that have failed to govern and failed to provide these basic services to citizens, it's now left upon those citizens to take on those roles by themselves and privately. Essentially, it's a form of privatization of certain state duties, such as that of providing basic services.
That's fascinating. We have a question from the audience that is adjacent to this, a different topic, but let me put this out there. Question is, what will be the cost of the development of cities and infrastructure in developing country cities in the era of climate change? Are they not entitled to development, and what does that suggest for climate change policy?
Oh, let me deal with that, because that's been a favorite talking point of mine.
Go for it.
I'll put it straightforward. I think it is callous, new colonial, if not racist, of the Europeans to come to Africa and to preach to them that they cannot develop their own economies. Frankly, John Kerry was there the other day, and he said to us, we are all in this together. And he said something like, I think South Africa produces, numbers differ, something between 2 to 4% of the world's CO2 emissions. Now, the energy sector makes up, I think, 10 to 20% of all carbon emissions. Okay, how are you going to give the Africans cement, which is 7%, steel, which is 7%, agriculture, because there's food insecurity in some areas, which I think make up 40%. It's an impossibility to do it. So I think the obsession of the European elites, and it's only a European problem, it's a problem of rich kids in rich countries, frankly, to try and preach to the developing world that they cannot develop their own economies. I think it is going to create a massive geopolitical standoff that you don't want. And we are seeing signs of it. In 2015, the head of the African Development Bank made an extraordinary statement that was broadcasted throughout Africa, but no European newspaper picked up on it, where he said, Africa cannot develop without coal, point, end of discussion. Okay, we need to use these resources under our feet to develop. Now, fine, again, in the energy sector, there are solutions. You don't have to be as carbon intensive as in the past. You don't have to use coal everywhere, for example. You can use solar panels, you can use nuclear power, but we don't have water for nuclear power. Okay, we have a thorium-based solution that we try to develop. It's a theoretical concept. LNG, there's a massive LNG finding in Mozambique where they're shooting each other over a tribal conflict at the moment. LNG can offset some of the core carbon emissions. So there are practical solutions to this. But at the end of the day, if the Africans are not going to get investment from the World Bank or the IMF, they're either going to do it themselves, I hope they do that, or the Chinese are going to do it for this, because China does not care about preaching about carbon emissions. It's a unique religion in the West. I don't entirely get it, but I would kind of wish that those people stop preaching to the developing world.
Okay, that's understood and very clear. Yeah, that's right. No, thanks for that. Another question that we have here is the urban-rural divide a political divide in other country cities as it is in America? I assume that is referring to you have concentrations of progressives in cities, and you have conservatives out in rural areas. And that has political consequences for America. gets analyzed a lot. Is that same phenomenon happening elsewhere?
Yeah, maybe because I've been getting ready to write an article about the just like in China, Mao, the Chinese Communist Revolution ended up coming from the countryside. I think we're already seeing signs of this in Europe, in the Netherlands, in France, where people in the, if you will, the tangible economy, people who live in the outer ring of Paris, and of course they got to drive. They're not going to get to work any other way. I think this is going to become an enormous conflict. If we go with a strategy of solar and wind, the only place that's going to be built in most cases will be in the rural areas, because guess what? The people who want the clean energy don't want to generate it any place close to where they live. Could you imagine somebody proposing, why don't we take Staten Island and fill it with solar panels? I think that this conflict with the rural areas, and then of course you get into the issues of food, which both Becky and Hugo have brought up. I would not like to be the federal agent who goes to the ranchers in Montana and asks them to get rid of half of their herd. I don't think that agent will have a very long lifespan. You've got farmers in America, in Australia, in Canada, and probably in South Africa as well, who are feeding the world, and they're being told, no, you're not feeding the world the right way. And so you're going to have to accept 50% reduction in your productivity. So this is part of that sort of neo-colonial thing that Hugo was touching on, but it also has a geographic element. So it's not necessarily that people are conservative, but you move to the countryside and then somebody says, well, we're going to put 50 windmills and a gigantic solar plant in your community. Well, I moved to this community because it was nice and rural and bucolic. And now you're telling me that I've got to have, the dark satanic mills next to me.
No, I just make a point there. There is, as I say, just to repeat, there is room for these technologies. Solar panels, for example, work very well with desalinated water. Africa needs water. Okay, so there is an argument to make that they have a definite role to play. So I'm not taking ideological stance against them, but we're making the very, I think, big point that the road that Europe and Asia followed for their own development, and North America, has been through high intense energy, urbanization, factories, all the things that was common sense. There is a bit of an idea that you can just teach Africans to code and we're going to leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution. That's very difficult if you come from subsistence agriculture, in some areas. So that's sort of, it's part of the broader problem that we have a digitalization, a digital world that the elites live in. And I think the average ordinary person is not entirely in that world yet.
Thanks. Thank you for that, Hugo, and to all of you. Thanks for your presentations and comments today. We could go on, but we are running up against the end of our time here. Appreciate you joining us from the various parts of the globe for this discussion. And for those of you watching today, thank you for being our guests. And we'll look forward to doing more discussions about these topics as we go forward and roll out the book and have a continued discussion about some of the issues which I know we left unresolved. And like all these kinds of conversations, you end up raising questions that we don't have time to answer. So we'll continue that process in future events. And until then, everyone be well, be safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.